Right, okay, let's crack on. So thank you for inviting me to talk to you about our strategy at NICE, as well as how we've used the MAGICapp over the past year. So here's a slide that we've used to introduce our strategy, and I'm aiming to cover that first, and then some more detail about the MAGICapp. But when we were producing our strategy, which was quite a challenge, because we were doing that at the beginning of the pandemic, so things weren't quite as we had expected, we talked to opinion leaders from around the world to see what was changing across the system. And these were the key things that we identified and that then fed into our strategy. I'm not going to go to lots of detail in this slide, but the rapid pace of innovation in health technologies, we heard loud and clear. And the increasing use of data, real world evidence, digital products, all of that was really important to people. And we felt we needed to take that into account in our future HTA work, as well as in our guideline development. So lots and lots changing, I think, was what we saw. And of course, that all became much more dramatic as the course of the pandemic wore on. The strategy that some of you may have seen has 4 key pillars, and we wanted to keep it simple. We wanted to keep it something we could remember. Pillar 1 around rapid, robust technology evaluation. I'm not going to say any more about that, but I do want to obviously focus on pillar 2, dynamic living guideline recommendations. I'll say a bit about pillar 3, having effective guidance uptake to maximize our impact. And pillar 4 is underpinning all of that, really, leadership in data research and science. So living guidelines. I started at NICE back in 2001, and it wasn't long before people were talking to me then about how quickly should we keep guidelines up to date. And there were people talking about living guidelines then, 20 years ago, but in general, it all seemed too difficult. It seemed too difficult to do in terms of being a guideline developer, but it also seemed too difficult to do if you were somebody implementing a guideline. People said to us, hey, you know, we just about managed to put your guideline into practice over 2 or 3 years. Please don't keep changing them, because we'll never be able to keep up. And I think it's interesting to reflect that world 20 years ago, because it clearly has changed. And what we heard when we were talking to people about the strategy was an expectation that guidelines should be up to date. People use digital interfaces, they use technology to access recommendations, and they expect them to be up to date. So we really had to take that on board in our new strategy. But to do that, we also need a new guideline structure that will make it easier for us to keep up to date, but also make it easier for users to find the underpinning evidence. And to do all of that, we need flexible, rapid methods, so we can pick up on the key questions and that need to be answered, and also address feedback and inequalities. Inequalities was in here because of what people experienced during the pandemic. And this slide highlights on the right some of the early priorities in taking that forwards. It's not going to be an overnight change from the 400-ish guidelines that we currently have to having a set of living guidelines. And the first part of doing that will be focusing that guideline portfolio into some core topic areas, those core topics that we can keep up to date. And we need that new digital guidelines platform, one of our early priorities, to put that in place, new mechanisms to gather feedback. And then, you know, our guidelines manual. All of us working in the guidelines world, we write down how we do our work, and we need to make sure all of this is included in our manual. And just one slide on the pillar 3 of our strategy, because it's very linked to the living guidelines. And we particularly want to make sure that the second bullet here is in place, improving digital access to NICE guidelines to make it easier to find the recommendations through a range of routes. Because we know that some people will come to the NICE website, but some people will want to use an interface that they might have in their hospital or their GP surgery, or indeed there might be third-party providers of evidence-based services that should be able to easily take the recommendations from NICE and embed them in their own front-facing products. There's obviously lots of other things we need to do to maximise our impact, not least tracking how people are using the recommendations. And we think getting this whole thing more digital will help us to have a feedback loop and find out how much the recommendations have been used. So the pandemic. I started my time as chief executive at NICE on the 1st of April. So just after the UK had gone into lockdown. It was an interesting time, and NICE was asked to respond to the pandemic by producing some rapid guidelines. And our normal timescale for producing a guideline is 1 to 2 years, usually closer to the 2 years than the 1 year, it has to be said. That wasn't going to work for the pandemic, so we rapidly developed some interim methods and processes, put together a cross-specialty group, and managed to develop guidelines in 5 to 10 days, as did lots of other people around the world. We were all pulling together to try and do this very quickly. And in the end, we produced 25 rapid guidelines. And because these were very much a prototype of having a living guideline, we have done over 100 updates to these guidelines since they were published. A great way of working internationally, collaborating on that new evidence and demonstrating how we can keep guidelines up to date. And we also did a guideline on the long-term effects of COVID-19. That wasn't one of the first things we were asked to do, as you might imagine, but it probably is going to be one of the ones with the longest impact, unfortunately. So why did we decide to test some of these COVID-19 guidelines on the MAGICapp? Well, you probably worked out by some of the things I've been saying about needing to have a living approach, keeping them up to date. That speed that we needed to be following to develop and update the guidelines meant that using MAGICapp was going to really help us with the product. We had a lot of people working with us at any one time, an internal team, external people, and we needed to integrate things from other guidelines too developed elsewhere. So there were lots of challenges that we had, and we really felt that MAGICapp was going to be a good solution for all of these challenges. And the benefits were, as you guys all know, I probably don't need to tell you, it really helped with the continuous updating. It made it easier to work together. So there's different groups that I described. Creating the evidence and the grade tables was much simpler. There was less admin work and a central version control. So in this pretty intense hothouse environment of doing these rapid guidelines, it gave us a really good solution. And we didn't do all our 25 rapid guidelines in MAGICapp because we'd started some of this work beforehand. But we brought a number of the rapid guidelines together around managing COVID-19 in MAGICapp, as well as the one about managing the long-term effects of COVID-19 or long COVID, and a more recent guideline on vaccine-induced immune thrombocytopenia and thrombosis. So we've got those 3 living guidelines in the MAGICapp. One of the really useful functions of using MAGICapp was the remote decision-making approach. Everybody was virtual at this point, so NICE's traditional bringing everybody into a room around a committee table wasn't going to work. And therefore, having all the virtual panel members made it much more straightforward. there was more time at the panel meetings to actually have a discussion around the tricky issues, and it gave the NICE team additional flexibility with their timing. So overall, this gave us more efficiencies and more time in the living guideline process. So everybody was really grateful for this approach. And just reiterating some of the benefits, thinking about the topics that we did, the development time for the vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia and thrombosis guideline, we developed and published that in 2 months. Developing and synthesizing data, using them in the Managing COVID-19 guideline, the collaboration around MAGICapp enabled faster publication and speed of updates. So lots of benefits. I think you had a workshop this morning with the team, and hopefully they emphasized some of these points about how useful it was in this scenario. So this is particularly the example around COVID, of course, but you have to think back to our strategy and what we're going to need to do, and we need to reflect on all these benefits. We also looked at what users thought, because of course users of NICE guidelines are not familiar with coming to the NICE website and finding guidelines in this format. So we wanted to get some feedback, because of course we need to think about what should we do in the future. We gave a demonstration of MAGICapp, you might be interested to know, to the NICE board. We've got quite a new board of non-executives at the moment, and they thought this was really good, really clever, really easy to use. So that was very positive. The feedback that you see on this slide came from over 100 users of NICE guidelines, and they were mostly from healthcare, frontline professionals. So this is what they thought, and it might be feedback that you've already had from other quarters, but I thought it was worth just showing it now. The main positive things that people felt about this presentation was the menu on the left, the clear, succinct recommendations, and of course NICE recommendations can be quite long, so clearly people appreciated these being clear and short, and they liked the layering of information and the layering of evidence, and that's something that NICE has been aiming to do for a long time, that ability to drill down to the evidence. So really good to get that positive feedback from our audiences. In terms of areas of improvement on the right, you might be able to tell me that some of these things are being looked at already, but what we heard was that people didn't find it necessarily easy to identify updates. It wasn't easy to find other tools and resources, and sometimes the product wasn't as quick, as speedy as it should have been. And then there was some mixed feedback about how it was pulling COVID content together, some queries about the strength of recommendations, and information for specific groups and settings. Now that bit about strength of recommendations is probably something that's specific to NICE, because many moons ago we removed from our recommendations any grading around strength of the evidence or strength of the recommendations for various reasons. I won't go into now, but it was taken away. So it's interesting that it's had mixed feedback. So some people will have liked it and clearly some others won't. So this is my final slide, and just to tell you what we're going to do next, because we've obviously got to move forwards with our strategy, of which living guidelines is a key plank, and we want to take forward the learning and the experience that we've got from using MAGICapp. And then we need to think about our existing guideline portfolio. And it's, as I said, it's a massive portfolio at the moment. We need to rationalize that, and we need to think about whether all of that is going to be applied to a living model, or whether we have to rationalize it in some way and prioritize the types of recommendations that in future will work in a living model. And all of this, the aim is to have guideline recommendations that are useful, usable and used and aligned to our users' needs. Those words, the director of our guidelines program, Paul Crisp, that you might know, uses a lot. Guidelines that are useful, usable and used. And finally, we want to make sure the underpinning evidence for those recommendations is there in a way that can help shared decision making. So it's particularly important in the UK context, supporting clinicians to have conversations with patients, and we want to make sure they can access that underpinning evidence. So as a summary, lots and lots of positive learning, lots of great experience with the MAGICapp, and we'll have to come back and follow up this conversation around what we do next. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take a few questions if there's time.